Well, thanks, Park, very much for the invitation, and Irma also for organizing this. I know we're a little over time, so I'll be brief. It's been the end of an amazing day. I really appreciate the chance to participate, to read ahead of time, and to think about these issues. So I'll share my screen and share some thoughts about the background paper from Irma and Park, about the work from Anna and David that they just presented. And I want to make sure that I recognize kind of what an amazing group this is. So, I noticed Deborah Frank, in our group now, the founder of the Children's Health Watch, the creator of that emergency room screener and so forth. Shelley Verplug is here, did so much at ERS and now at George Washington University. And we really want to hear from Alicia, Coleman Jensen at the end, because she'll share a lot. So I'll be brief here. But just to say three things. First of all, reading the background paper, I wanted to dig into the prehistory a little bit and think about Kathy Radimer and her dissertation advisor, Christine Olsen, how when they were responding in the prehistory of the measurement, the 25 years we're talking about, they were in the 1980s responding to this very deep US recession that they saw around them. And Kathy Radimer's dissertation, I'll show you some material from it, how people meet their food needs is vulnerable to either loss of income or a rise in non-food expenses. And particularly, this happens really only when they have low family wealth or other social safety nets. So asking about food security turns out to be this very, very exquisite measure of precarity, of insecurity in general. And then in particular, having been at the Friedman School now for 12 years, absorbed in clinical research, metabolic chambers, understanding nutrition, we know a lot about how people generally maintain energy balance or gain weight if weight gain is triggered. And that therefore the food insecurity changes that happen when people lose income or have other expenses and they don't have savings, lots of things change, but energy balance is usually caused by something else. So people either maintain or gain weight. As David just said, the weight loss question really has very little traction in these surveys. So frontiers of measurement, David's presentation about personal food security, this extraordinary result I would highlight about adolescents, very interesting. I'll show you a take on his data in a moment. And then Anna Poblacion's paper, also very, very interesting, about asking fewer questions, getting almost no false positives, but those very interesting false negatives. So I want to speak for a minute about Kathy Radimer. I never got to meet her, and I did talk with her advisor, Christine Olsen, but I've never worked really closely in this area. If you haven't seen it, Christine Olsen does a marvelous description of the story of all this in a video. You see the link here. And she was working in the 1980s when the sort of depths of social conflict in America are hard to remember. The degree to which the Reagan administration was callous in the extreme during a very deep recession. This quote from the Attorney General at the time, "I don't know if there's any hungry children." I've heard a lot of, it was an awful, awful time. Meanwhile, the mayors are saying this is a terrible crisis caused by the enormous recession of 1980, 80, 81, 82, and 83. So this led to a dissertation in the late 80s, funded by NSF with additional funds. It's hard to imagine, like, if that hadn't happened, where would we be now? So published gradually, but published in these supplements, which honestly just are not in our library. It's just astonishing that the original work from Kathy Radimer, from Christine Olsen, is just very hard to find, actually. And I wanted to say a word about sort of where it comes from, because it's important to me. So I work mainly in Africa, and so did Kathy Radimer. She had worked in Burkina in the 70s, extreme undernourishment, hunger in every form of it, and then Cameroon, slightly wealthier country, and then came to Cornell in 1984 in the depths of this recession. And entering the world of thinking about hunger in the United States, these were the four questions that's been mentioned before from the USDA's survey conducted in 77, 78, and then 79, 90. And then this continuing survey that asked every 2 months these questions. And clearly, Kathy Radimer realized this was not enough. So what does she do? She does these in-depth interviews, this is the kind of quote she gets. Just an amazing, if you read the actual dissertation, it is just a stunning work of qualitative ethnography and then economics and nutrition. So, going deeper into the person, into the histories of these people, there's a lot of intersectoral, intersectional, and a lot of race, gender issues going on in the stories of the respondents that led to her forming the original very long questionnaire. So she, in her dissertation, tested 30 questions, just an extraordinary variety of formulations of these phrases. Of course, all this was in English. We've learned very interesting things about the different Spanish phrases that might be used, about the different Chinese language phrases that might be used. Here's the English phrases that she used in this upstate New York context. Lots of different questions, ultimately winnowing it down to these 10. It's just about the money. It's just asking, do people have the savings? Do people have the social insurance, the safety nets that would enable them to cope with an increase in expenses or a loss of income? What's interesting about those questions from an economics point of view is that food insecurity does not closely follow trends in income. So you can have quite rapid income growth or stagnation, and food insecurity might not change very much. So, during this period of the USDA data from 1995, the first 5 years of this were an economic boom from 95 to 2000, then relative stagnation from 2000, then this recession and food insecurity spikes. Now, that cross-country comparisons are done with not the USDA measure, but with this FAO measure, 8 items, a RASH score. They, of course, are choosing where to do the cutoffs of the RASH score, just like USDA chooses where to do the cutoffs. And they've done that in a way that is where they get a much lower prevalence of severe food insecurity in the US, but comparable for moderate. And they get this steady growth in food insecurity in the world as a whole. So I find this quite puzzling and hard to understand what accounts for this growth in food insecurity around the world when people's average incomes are rising. And I think it has a lot to do with the non-food expenses that are rising often as fast or even faster as they did here in the 90s. So turning to the frontiers of measurement, just very quickly, I thought that David's presentation was just terrific about a paper that was extremely interesting to read. And in order to try to turn the tables into something that a simple economist like me could understand, so the statistics are really tricky in both these cases. Anna Poblacion's papers using advanced statistics for clinical metrics, David Ribar's papers using very advanced statistics from psychometrics and IRT. Here we're just looking at the raw data, and to see the relative magnitudes around the different questions that were asked. You see the adults and adolescent responses much more frequently affirming these various conditions. And so what I did is just stack them so you could see the person sometimes did the thing or often did the thing as the more severe instance of it, where did not eat for a whole day, adolescents 1.4% of respondents, adults only 1%, children, as David said, almost never. So clearly families really protecting child feeding occasions. And what really struck me is just the much greater rate of affirming these conditions for adolescents, and really puzzled by whether this has to do with the adolescent growth process and the idea that adolescents experience the same level of household deprivation more severely because they themselves have greater need. They're more hungry, they're more needing of food because and want a bigger meal and want to eat more often than adults, or whether it's an intra-household allocation issue and possible discrimination against kids in the household, but against adolescents, excuse me, in the household. So very interesting. Don't know. And then regarding Anna Poblacion's paper, she explained it very, very well. And the most important thing about it really is that the slides were just terrific, presenting it in such a clear way. And I was just very struck by this point about the false the false negatives. So when you use the abbreviated scale of 8 items, you get this 20% food insecurity rate. When you use the original household survey module with 18 items, you get this 22% food insecurity rate. And there's these 1,300 people who are false negatives. And I was really curious, just to dig into who are they, to ask a little bit more about which of the omitted questions ask about the type of deprivation that they experienced. And especially I would love to be able to go back to, to see a paper with some of the visualizations that were presented in the slides, or to look more carefully at those. So thanks very much for a great opportunity to think about all this.
That was just terrific. So we invite the entire audience to use the question and answer link. And we've also got some questions coming in through our text interface. For starters, I'll invite Alicia if you're, I'm glad to read it, but I'd like to invite Alicia to turn on camera and ask a question. Not hearing her yet. I'm going to read a question. This is a question for Dr. Oh, there we go with Alicia. Great.
Sorry, my Zoom was a little slow to wake up. So this is for Anna and colleagues. So as far as I understand, you were taking a subset of items that were already asked in the Children's Health Watch to create the scale, which is wonderful, by the way. But I'm wondering if you had any thoughts about how the results might differ if the abbreviated scale was asked alone. Not in the full context of the full food security module.
That's Thanks. A great question. Great question. Thank you, Alicia. So we will be able actually to respond to this question when the longitudinal COVID study wave 3 of Children's Health Watch will take place in 2023. We will include the ACAFs in the COVID study with the 2 items, because on wave 2 we included the first, preliminary version, and we asked it the 6 item short form plus the 2 items, so we plus the 3 items. So we do have some kind of results, but given the amount of false negatives, I wouldn't really look into that. But in a year time, I will probably be able to respond that question to you.
Great. A second question is my own for David and Rodrigo. I was reflecting on the difference between personal food security and household food security. And one of your themes at the end in conclusion is that the personal food security is distinct from household food security. But in a sense, just if you're very literalistic and read the definition of household food security, you can also see the difference in that way. If household food security is enough for all household members at all times, then you can see that we sort of expect that household indicator to trigger if any of the individual members don't have food security. But I think mathematically, the pattern that you're finding is different from that. And so my question amounts to, did you understate how much trouble your result is going to cause? Did you understate what the potential implication is for the way we've been reading household level food security literally?
I think the caution here is, each of it. I think it's similar to the way that in our papers we discuss causality and we discuss significance. We know what we're talking about when we say describe something as significant, or we know what something means when we've just got an association rather than a causal result. With the household measures, we know that individual experiences might vary from one person to the next. But when we begin talking about the household scale, very quickly we slip into language where we're using personal language rather than household language. And one of the things that our results are showing is that there is a personal element to it. We are going to explore a little bit farther, so we can take a look in one-person households, how the responses differ between what's being reported for the household versus the individual, to get at some of the differences in severity and some of the differences in the time frame that's associated with that. We know that mathematically, if somebody's experiencing something, it should be reported. But it does appear that there are some situations where somebody's experiencing, but not everybody's experiencing it.
Great. So the next question is a little bit related, and it's for both of these papers. It's also, you can tell it's motivated again by a somewhat a literalistic approach to reading these questions. It has to do with the question about going hungry. So the many years ago, when the Second National Academy's Sinstat panel recommended against using the word hunger in the categorical descriptions, their motivation had to do with describing hunger as inherently a personal experience rather than a household experience. And first thing, just as a matter of definition, I've never been quite sure that is correct, just because hunger has always meant in the US context both the physical experience of hunger and the social problem of society not having enough food. But the second thing about that decision is it's related to David's presentation about whether there's a sort of a second scale factor that is related to personal items as opposed to household conditions. The reason why the same question was interesting for Anna is I'm not sure I have it quite right, but I'm not sure I'm remembering right. But I think that that the hunger question for children especially was retained as a key threshold question in the sort of the final preferred short scale that you described. And whether I have the facts exactly right on that or not, I'd be interested in your comment on that particular question. So for both of you thinking about the connection between actually asking households about hunger and the personal experience of a particular family member.
Anna, do you want to go first?
Sure, thank you. Okay, how can I say that? I think hunger is a social problem, and I think the food security measures a social problem addressed in several different levels. Since a level that could be I'm worried about it, a level that could be I decrease the amount of food I eat, or a level that I say I decrease the quantity, not only me, but everyone in my household decreases the quantity of food. And that to me is an indication of a societal problem, a much bigger problem that is not, I skipped a meal today because I didn't have money to buy food, but because I didn't have time to go and grab some money from the bank. So we need to differentiate that kind of hunger that everybody in this world has experienced someday, felt hungry. But this is a chronic condition based on or rooted on a societal problem. And that is the hunger that the food security measures.
And Parke, I think I agree with you. I've always been puzzled by how the NRC came to that conclusion when you've got two questions explicitly about hunger that are in the food security household scale. And then you've got questions about not eating for an entire day that are asked both about adults and children. So, that scale is asking about somebody's experiences with hunger. And I think, we are finding indications of both hunger and not eating for an entire day in the personal scale, which validates that, people are experiencing this outcome. So I think it might be okay to refer to people with very low food security as having indications of hunger.
Great. Well, very interesting. And by the way, I'm not suggesting a renaming. Once category names have been sort of well understood by both a research community and also a policy community, it's often good to just let it be. At the time, I mentioned in my opening comments, just remembering in 1999 hearing this presentation from Richard Bavier at the Office of Management and Budget, who was he was a critic of household food survey-based household food security measurement. And part of his complaint wasn't about personal versus household. It was just that the threshold for being counted as food insecure with hunger was more permissive than the threshold that actually triggered people answering that question affirmatively. So he just didn't like it that there were some people being counted as food insecure with hunger who hadn't affirmed the hunger question. But his objection wasn't as philosophical as being about personal versus household characteristics. So your responses, both of your responses, bring me to my next question, which has to do with thinking about frequency of hardship as a measure of severity. So as Anna is talking about the difference between hunger as a social problem and hunger as an individual problem, she's partly talking about whether it's chronic, because in your response, part of what made it characteristic. And I thought that's an interesting topic too, because more than most of the papers probably in this series and more than typical for the field, David's paper used more of the information in the questions about frequency of response rather than converting all the questions to binary indicators. So my question for both of you, each in their own way, is how much does frequency of affirming hardship serve as a measure of the severity of hardship?
Obviously we used that information. We've actually thought a little bit about whether to recommend dropping the often category or not. We think that it does indicate severity, but when we're taking a look at it, an issue with asking those questions in that way is that we still come up with a unidimensional scale where the frequency of how something is happening gets tied up with the severity of a condition as well. And I think that if we had better questions about when hunger was, or when these hardships are being experienced, how often, how much they overlap, that with those types of questions, that we might be able to tease out a separate dimension of how chronic some of these issues are, or get other interesting timing patterns.
And on the timing, I think you've done some work on monthly cycles. I've done some work on monthly cycles. My dissertation was on that topic in connection with SNAP many years ago. And then Hilary Seligman, who was our first discussant, is known for a paper about a connection between hospitalizations for, I think, diabetes and related conditions and risk of food security. So Anna next. And then I'm going to turn to a question from John Cook, your collaborator. But first.
Yeah, we didn't investigate frequency of hardships because the questions we chose were not, how many months or how many, how frequent it was, but, the ACAF's current version does not have any questions like that. But I know that Mark Nord did wonderful work around that. And it is intermittent. That's why I think the majority of, the surveys use the 12-month because of it's dependent on income, and because it's so related to socioeconomic status and low socioeconomic status, you know that you get, you know, income, then you don't have it, and then you have it, and then you don't have it. So a 12-month period captures all these fluctuations into getting in and out, in and out, in and out, food insecurity. So I would recommend people reading Mark Nord's paper. I think it's very instructive, but we did not assess that.
Great.